The alarm clock didn't scream, it buzzed with a dull, persistent vibration that Elias had learned to anticipate. 5:00 a.m. In the military, this was the start of the day. In his new civilian life, it was the start of his survival strategy. Elias sat up, his body stiff, and immediately began the routine. No hesitation, no staring at the wall, no room for the ghosts to catch up to him. He was a machine fueled by the singular objective of winning back his daughter, and machines didn't have the luxury of depression. He hit the pavement for his morning run before the town even stirred, the cold air biting into his lungs like a reminder that he was still alive, still capable, still here. His work at the mechanic shop was the anchor he desperately needed. The owner, a grizzled man named Miller who cared more about transmission fluid than politics or PTSD, gave him no special treatment. Elias liked it that way. The smell of oil, the grease that stained his hands black, the constant, rhythmic clanging of metal, it was the only environment that silenced the ringing in his ears. When he was under the hood of a car, focusing on a broken fuel injector or a misaligned sensor, there was no room for the memories of Iraq. There was only the problem and the solution. By noon, his body felt like it had been put through a grinder, but his mind was clear. For the first time, he found he could focus for hours without the terrifying, sudden jumps of adrenaline that had defined his first few months back. He was becoming predictable, invisible, a civilian in the most literal sense. "Thorne!" Miller's voice barked from the office. "Parts delivery at the front. Keep your head on straight." "Copy that," Elias replied, the familiar military jargon slipping out before he could catch it. He didn't cringe. He just kept moving. Every evening after the shop closed, he would head to the library. He had become a regular, the man in the worn jacket who sat at the back table with stacks of legal volumes. He was no longer just reading, he was dissecting the law. He looked for precedents, for statutes, for any loophole that could give a father with a service. Connected disability a fair shot in a court system that prioritized the status quo. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore, he was an amateur legal tactician, mapping out Sarah's defenses, preparing for the day he would finally be on the stand. The routine was his armor. It was grueling, monotonous, and completely devoid of joy, but it was safe. It was a barrier between him and the darkness that threatened to return the second he slowed down. As he walked back to his motel room under the pale streetlights, he pulled out his phone. No calls, no texts. Just a single photo of Lily he kept as his wallpaper, a tiny beacon of light in the cold dark of his screen. He touched the glass, a soft, deliberate gesture of connection. "One day closer," he whispered to the night. He went to sleep the moment his head hit the pillow, his body giving out from the sheer physical exertion of the day. For the first time in years, the nightmares were distant, muffled by the exhaustion of a man who had built a life on the foundations of discipline. He was building a wall, brick by brick, and behind it he was quietly, methodically, preparing for war. The first crack in Elias's meticulously constructed armor appeared on a Thursday afternoon. He was finishing an oil change on a vintage sedan, his mind already drifting toward the upcoming weekend, his scheduled visitation time with Lily. He had bought a new set of art supplies and a small box of non-toxic paints. He had imagined them sitting at a table in the park, the sunlight filtering through the trees, making a mess and laughing. It was the only thing that kept him breathing through the grime of the shop. Then, his phone vibrated in his pocket. A text from Sarah. "Can't make it this weekend. Something came up. Family trip, don't wait at the center." The world seemed to lurch. Elias felt the familiar, dangerous surge of cold adrenaline prickling at the base of his neck, but he slammed the lid of the toolbox shut with a violence that made the other mechanics jump. He didn't respond. He didn't lash out. He walked into the bathroom and stared at himself in the mirror until the red haze behind his eyes faded. Don't react, think. He drove to the park anyway, sitting in his truck at the edge of the lot. He watched the empty swing set, the chains swaying in a light breeze. The family trip was a lie. He knew Sarah's schedule better than she probably thought. He realized then that she wasn't just busy, she was testing him. She was seeing how much he would take, how quickly he would break if she kept the girl away. The next day, Elias walked into the office of the lawyer Mac had helped him secure, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Clara Vance who specialized in difficult family cases. She listened to him, not with pity, but with a growing, professional interest as he detailed the missed visits, the manipulation, and the blatant disregard for the temporary court order. "She's playing the long game, Mr. Thorne," Clara said, her voice dry as parchment. She tapped a pen against the stack of files Elias had provided, the detailed logs he'd kept, the dates, the times, the broken promises. She thinks that by making you the absent father, she can frame your instability as abandonment. It's a classic tactic, but she's made a mistake. She thinks you're still the broken man who came home from the desert. She hasn't realized you've started fighting back. I don't want to fight for the sake of fighting, Elias said, his voice hard. I just want my daughter. She's 6 years old. She doesn't need a battlefield, she needs her father. Then we'll give her one, Clara replied. But to get what you want, we have to stop being nice. We have to file a motion to enforce the visitation order. And we need to start documenting everything she does to interfere. Every text, every cancellation, every excuse. If she wants to play the protective mother card, we'll show the court it's not protection, it's obstruction. Leaving the office, Elias felt a strange, chilling clarity. The realization that he had been playing by the rules while Sarah was cheating didn't make him angry anymore, it made him efficient. He wasn't the man who would beg for time with his daughter. He was a man who would secure it. He drove past the park once more on his way back to the motel. He looked at the swing set, now occupied by another child, and felt a surge of resolve. The weekend was stolen, yes, but it was the last one that would be. The silent battle had officially moved from the shadows of his mind into the light of the courtroom, and Elias Thorne was ready to hold his ground. The courthouse was a cold, imposing structure of limestone and steel, a temple to a system that seemed designed to grind a man down into dust. As Elias walked through the heavy double doors, the air hit him with that familiar, sterile scent of bureaucracy, floor wax, old paper, and suppressed desperation. Beside him, Clara Vance moved with the predatory grace of an apex predator. She didn't offer comfort, she offered strategy, her briefcase serving as her primary weapon. Keep your head down and your mouth shut, Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the busy corridor. Their lawyer, Miller, is going to try to trigger you. He knows about the service-connected PTSD, he knows the record is a goldmine for his narrative. He will deliberately try to make you look volatile, unstable, and prone to outbursts. You give him nothing. Elias nodded, his jaw locked in a rigid line. He had spent weeks in that mechanic shop, training himself to stay focused on the task at hand, to ignore the noise, and to breathe through the pressure. He felt like he was back in a combat zone, but instead of IEDs, he was navigating landmines of legal terminology and character assassination. The hearing room was small and airless. Across the table, Sarah sat with her attorney, a slick, impeccably dressed man who looked like he had never spent a day in the real world. Sarah looked polished, confident, and utterly convinced of her own righteousness. When she looked at Elias, her eyes didn't show anger, they showed the patronizing pity one might reserve for a wounded animal that needed to be put down. The hearing began, and Miller immediately went for the jugular. He stood up, gesturing toward Elias as if he were a specimen in a jar. Your Honor, we are dealing with a man who has barely been back on civilian soil for 6 months. He is struggling with severe PTSD, he has no permanent residence, and he has a history of impulsive, aggressive behavior. To force a child into his unsupervised care is not just unwise, it is dangerous. Elias felt the heat rising in his neck, the primal urge to stand up and shout, to tell them about the letters, about the wooden horses, about the years he spent in the sand, trying to protect the very society that was now declaring him unfit. His hands resting on the table began to tremble. Clara leaned over and placed a firm hand on his wrist, a warning more potent than any shout. Don't. He forced himself to exhale, to count to 5, to imagine he was under the hood of that vintage sedan, focused only on the mechanics, not the man. He stared at his own hands, the grease still deeply embedded in his skin, a symbol of the honest, hard life he was trying to build, and waited. Mr. Thorne's service record is a matter of pride, not a liability, Clara said, her voice cutting through the slick lawyer's performance. He was a model soldier who served 3 tours of duty. To punish him for his service by denying him his fundamental right as a father is a violation of the very spirit of family law. We aren't here to discuss his past. We are here to discuss the fact that Sarah Thorne has actively blocked every court-ordered visitation for the last 6 weeks, purely out of personal spite. The debate raged on for an hour, a grueling, surgical dissection of Elias's life. Every mistake he had made in the last few months, the fired jobs, the motel, the isolation, was dragged into the light, twisted and repurposed as proof of his incapacity. Miller painted a picture of a man who was ticking away, an accident waiting to happen. While Sarah sat there, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Elias felt the walls of the room closing in. He looked at the judge, a stern-faced woman who looked like she hadn't smiled in a decade, and realized that to her, he wasn't a father, he was a statistic. He was a veteran case, with a high probability of failure. When it was finally his turn to speak, his voice felt like sandpaper. "I'm not the man I was before I left, Your Honor," he said, keeping his eyes locked on the judge, refusing to look at Sarah. "I've seen things that changed me, but I'm not a monster. I'm a father who has been stripped of his home and his daughter. And I'm doing everything in my power to build a stable life that I can share with her. All I'm asking for is a chance to prove that I am the father Lily needs." It was the most honest thing he had said in years. The room went silent. For a brief, terrifying moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something in the judge's eyes, not sympathy, perhaps, but the cold, hard recognition of a man who had fought for his life and refused to give up. The judge adjusted her glasses, her gaze drifting between Elias and Sarah. The legal battle was just beginning, but as Elias left the room, his heart still hammering a furious rhythm against his ribs, he knew one thing for certain: he hadn't cracked. He hadn't given them the outburst they wanted. He had survived the first day of the trial, and for a soldier, survival was the first step toward victory. The silent battle was shifting, and he was finally gaining ground. The victory of surviving the hearing was short-lived. Elias walked out of the courthouse, the cold air hitting his face, feeling as though he'd just retreated from a firefight where the casualties were his own dignity. Clara had managed to secure a schedule increase, but it was meager, a small bone tossed to a hungry dog. It wasn't enough, not by a long shot. "They think they've got you cornered," Mac said, as they leaned against Elias's truck in the parking lot. Mac had taken the day off from his own job to be there, a silent anchor in the storm of legal maneuvering. "They think you're just a broken veteran who can't hold his life together. We need to flip the narrative. We need to show the court that while you're out there grinding, she's out there neglecting." Elias looked at his friend. "How? She's careful. She's surrounded by a perfect life, perfect friends, perfect reputation. Anything I find she'll just frame as me stalking her." "Not stalking," Mac corrected, his eyes narrowing with a familiar tactical intensity. "Observation, it's about data collection. If she wants to play the concerned mother card, let's see how that holds up against reality." Over the next few weeks, the game changed. Elias and Mac moved through the shadows of the suburbs, keeping a respectful, tactical distance. They weren't looking to harass, they were looking for patterns. It was tedious, soul-crushing work. They watched the house from the darkened interior of Elias's truck, noting the times Lily was left alone with sitters, people Elias didn't know, people who looked more interested in their phones than the 6-year-old girl playing in the yard. They saw Sarah leaving the house at odd hours, dressed for nights out that looked nothing like the family time she claimed in her affidavits. They saw the way Lily looked, often unattended, waiting on the front porch for a mother who was habitually late. It wasn't abusive in the dramatic sense, but it was the quiet, corrosive neglect of a woman who was too focused on her own life to make space for the child she claimed to be protecting so fiercely. Every night, Elias kept a log. He wrote down the times, the dates, and the observations with the precision of a field report. He didn't include his own feelings, he kept it strictly clinical, stripping away the hurt until only the cold, hard facts remained. "Look at this," Max said one evening, pointing to a photo he'd snapped of Sarah pulling up to the house at 2:00 a.m., her hair disheveled, her gait unsteady. "She's not just a busy mom, Elias. She's living a life that she's hiding from the court. She's prioritizing everything but that kid." Elias stared at the grainy image. A flicker of cold rage ignited in his chest, but he suppressed it. This wasn't about vengeance, it was about the truth. If the court wanted a version of reality, he would provide the version that couldn't be argued with. As the stack of documents in his binder grew, Elias felt his confidence returning. He was no longer a man reacting to the chaos of his life. He was a man gathering the elements of his own salvation. He realized that Sarah's greatest weapon against him, her reputation, was also her greatest weakness. She was hiding so much that it was only a matter of time before the cracks appeared, and he would be there, ready to pry them wide open. They were playing a dangerous game, and he knew it. If Sarah caught them, if her lawyer found out, the blowback would be catastrophic. But as he watched Lily climb out of her bed one evening through a dimly lit window, her movements small and lonely, Elias knew there was no turning back. He was a father, and he was coming to collect the truth. Every observation was a step, every line of evidence a weapon, and he was finally, systematically, dismantling the case against his own existence. The silent battle was turning in his favor, and the front lines were moving closer to home. The air in the courtroom was stifling, heavy with the scent of old dust, and the palpable tension of two people who had once shared a bed now, dissecting the corpse of their marriage under the harsh scrutiny of the law. Elias sat at the mahogany table, his hands steady, his posture erect. Beside him, Clara Vance was a study in controlled aggression, her folder already open, her pages flagged with colored tabs, a roadmap to dismantling the facade Sarah had spent months perfecting. Sarah sat opposite them, her composure slightly frayed. She looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that didn't come from working double shifts, but from the frantic, desperate effort of maintaining a lie that was beginning to unravel at the edges. Her lawyer Miller was still putting on a show, but the confidence was gone, replaced by a twitchy, reactive defensive posturing. Clara stood, her voice measured and lethal. "Your Honor, we are here today to revisit the temporary custody arrangement. Since the last hearing, we have gathered compelling evidence that the current environment for the minor child is not as stable as the mother has claimed." She didn't shout. She didn't grandstand. She simply laid the binder on the judge's desk, a collection of timestamps, photographs of Sarah arriving home in the early hours of the morning, and logs of sitters who spent more time staring at their phones than attending to a 6-year-old. It was a dossier of neglect, compiled with the cold, unyielding precision of a soldier's report. Elias watched the judge's face as she flipped through the pages. The stern lines around her eyes didn't soften, but they did sharpen, shifting from irritation to intense professional scrutiny. Miller tried to interrupt, his voice rising in protest, but the judge held up a hand, silencing him with a single, sharp look that made the slick attorney shrink back into his chair. "This is not just about a few late nights," Clara pressed, her eyes locking onto the judge. "This is about a pattern of prioritization that consistently leaves the minor child in the care of strangers while the mother engages in behavior that is fundamentally incompatible with the stable, child-centric environment the court requires." Thorne, on the other hand, has maintained steady employment, has completed a rigorous parenting program, and has been consistently present at the designated visitation point, rain or shine, despite the significant obstacles placed in his way. Sarah shot Elias a look of pure, unadulterated venom. She leaned over to Miller, whispering frantically, her hands shaking. Elias didn't look at her. He didn't gloat. He simply sat there, a silent observer in his own life, watching the tide begin to turn. He realized that this was the moment where the monster narrative started to collapse under the weight of mundane, verifiable reality. The judge looked up, her gaze lingering on Elias. For the first time, she didn't look at him as a liability, but as a man. "The court finds the evidence presented regarding the child's supervision concerning," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "The court is granting an increase in Mr. Thorne's visitation time, effective immediately. This will include 2 weekends a month unsupervised. Further monitoring will be required, but I expect complete cooperation from both parties. Any further obstruction of this schedule will be viewed as a direct violation of this court's order." Sarah let out a sharp, gasping sound, but Miller grabbed her arm, forcing her to be silent. Elias felt a wave of relief so intense he almost had to grip the table to keep from shaking. It wasn't full custody, and it wasn't the total victory he craved, but it was a foothold. It was a crack in the dam. As they exited the courthouse, Clara turned to him, her expression grim but satisfied. "That was a good day, Elias. She's rattled. She thought she could steamroll you. But now she knows we have eyes. She knows we have proof. She'll get more reckless now, more desperate. That's when we have to be at our best." Elias nodded, his mind already calculating the next steps. He walked out into the warm, late afternoon sun, and for the first time in a year, the air didn't feel like a heavy burden. It felt like oxygen. He had 2 weekends a month. 2 weekends to be a father, to show Lely that he was there, to prove that his home was a place of safety and love. He felt the weight of the months of struggle begin to lift, replaced by a soaring, razor-sharp hope. He had secured a foothold, and now, he was going to take the rest of the mountain. He took a deep breath, his lungs expanding with the sweet, clean promise of a victory that felt, finally, like his own. The silent battle was shifting, and the enemy was finally on the defensive. He drove back to the motel, not as a broken relic of the past, but as a man who had reclaimed a piece of his future. And as he planned the activities for the upcoming weekend, the art supplies, the parks, the simple, beautiful chaos of being a dad, he knew this was only the beginning of the return of the life he had fought so hard to save. The mechanic shop was the only place where Elias felt like himself. The grease on his hands, the smell of burnt oil, and the predictable, mechanical logic of engines were the antidotes to the chaotic, emotional quicksand of his divorce proceedings. But Sarah was a predator who didn't play by the rules of the court. She knew that if she couldn't hit him in the courtroom, she would hit him where it actually mattered: his survival. On a Tuesday afternoon, Miller called Elias into his office. The shop owner, a man whose face was etched with a lifetime of hard work, looked uneasy. He wasn't looking at Elias, but at a manila folder on his desk, one that looked suspiciously like the one Sarah and her lawyer carried. "Thorne, sit down," Miller said, his voice unusually strained. Elias felt a cold dread sink into his stomach. He sat, his back ramrod straight. "What's wrong, Miller?" "I got a call," Miller said, finally meeting his eyes. "Anonymous. Someone claiming that an employee here, specifically you, was involved in, let's just call it troubled incidents during your time in the service. They were very specific, Elias. They mentioned the incident with the foreman at the other warehouse. They suggested that I was exposing my business to a significant liability by keeping a mentally unstable veteran on the payroll." Elias felt the walls of the office shrink. He didn't have to ask who it was. The specificity of the accusations, the cold calculation behind the timing, it was Sarah's signature all over it. She was trying to strip away his stability, to make him look like a man who couldn't hold down a job, just like she had argued in court. "That incident at the warehouse was a misinterpretation, Miller," Elias said, keeping his voice carefully level, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "The foreman was disparaging people I served with. I was fired for standing up for my unit. It was a one-time event, and it has nothing to do with my work here. I've never been late, I've never missed a shift, and I've never caused a problem at your shop." Miller sighed, rubbing his temples. "Ooh, I believe you, Elias. I really do. You're one of the best mechanics I've had in years, but I've got a business to run. I've got insurance premiums. I've got other employees who don't need the stress of someone coming after the shop because of an anonymous caller. This could be the start of a smear campaign. If you fire me, she wins," Elias said, the desperation bleeding through his composure. "She's trying to force me back into that motel room, into that darkness, because if I lose my job, I lose my visitation. That's her game." Miller looked down at his desk, his silence heavy and prolonged. "I'm not firing you. Not yet. But Elias, you have to find out who's pulling these strings, and you have to cut them. If I get one more call, if there's one more incident, my hands are tied. I need you to be clean, and I need you to keep your head down. I can't be the one who gets caught in the crossfire of your divorce." Elias walked back to the garage, his movements robotic. He didn't let the rage show, but he felt it simmering beneath his skin like molten lead. Sarah was playing dirty, and she was doing it with a level of malice he hadn't thought her capable of. He found Mac waiting by his truck during their break. Elias told him everything, his voice shaking with the effort of containment. "She's escalating," Mac said, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the shop as if looking for the source of the threat. "She knows the judge is starting to see you as a viable father, so she's going to attack your livelihood. If she can't make you look like a bad father, she'll make you look like a failing employee." "It's tactical, Elias. How do I fight an invisible enemy?" Elias asked, staring at his grease-stained hands. "You don't fight them invisible," Mac said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low growl. "You force them into the light. We need to document every single one of these calls. We need to find out where they're coming from. And then, we present it to Clara. We show the judge that this isn't about concern. It's about a systematic, malicious attempt to destroy your ability to support your child. That's not protective mothering, Elias. That's harassment. And it's an offense that can sink her case." As the afternoon sun faded, casting long, jagged shadows across the shop floor, Elias looked at the engines he was working on. He realized that Sarah had made a tactical error. By trying to destroy his life, she had forced him to look deeper, to become more aggressive, and to stop holding back. She wanted to play dirty. Fine. He would learn the rules of this new game, and he would play them better than she ever could. He wasn't just a soldier, and he wasn't just a mechanic. He was a father whose survival instinct had been honed in the most brutal theaters of war. And he was done being the victim. The sabotage had failed, it had only sharpened the blade. The weeks following the sabotage attempt at the mechanic shop became a grueling endurance test. Every morning, Elias woke up with the phantom dread that today would be the day Miller finally threw in the towel and fired him. Every phone call, every unexpected visitor, every shadow in the parking lot triggered a spike of hyper-vigilance he couldn't quite dampen. He was working twice as hard to ensure his work was flawless, operating under a microscope that he knew Sarah was holding. The psychological toll began to fracture his resolve. The constant fear of losing his job, combined with the isolation of the motel room and the limited contact with Lily, started to erode his carefully constructed routine. The silence of the room, once an ally, began to howl with the voices of the past. He would find himself staring at the wall for hours, his hands gripping his knees until they turned white, fighting off the urge to simply walk out into the night and disappear, to stop fighting, to stop feeling, to just stop. It was during one of these nights that Max showed up unannounced. Sensing the shift in the wind, he found Elias sitting in the dark, the TV static providing the only light, his breathing shallow and erratic. "You're losing the line, Elias," Max said, his voice quiet, lacking the abrasive edge he usually used to force Elias into action. He pulled up a chair, sitting across from him in the gloom. "I'm tired, Mac," Elias confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "Every time I make progress, she knocks me back. Every time I get a foothold, the ground moves. I'm starting to think she's right, that I'm just not meant for this world, not meant to be a father." Mac didn't jump to the usual platitudes of "you're a hero" or "you're a strong soldier." Instead, he leaned forward, his face illuminated by the flickering light of the screen. "You think you're tired because you're fighting the wrong war. You're trying to win against her, and that's a war of attrition you can't win, because she's willing to burn everything down. You have to stop fighting her and start fighting for Lily. Every move you make, every hour you work, every dollar you save, it has to be for her, not against Sarah. It's hard to distinguish the two," Elias admitted. "That's because you're still looking at this through the lens of a tactical mission," Mac replied, tapping his finger against his temple. "In the field, you kill the threat. In this world, you outlast the threat. You become the stable, unwavering force that Sarah cannot destabilize. She's a wildfire, Elias. She'll burn herself out. You just have to hold the line." The conversation didn't fix everything, but it stopped the rot. Mac stayed until the sun came up, talking about anything football, old times, the stupid mistakes they had made as recruits, anything to keep Elias tethered to reality. When he left, Elias felt a strange, cold strength return to his limbs. He realized that holding the line wasn't about winning a single battle. It was about the refusal to be moved, even when the enemy threw everything they had at him. He went to work the next morning with a renewed, almost icy sense of purpose. When Miller approached him, hesitant and apologetic, Elias didn't wait for him to speak. "I've got the logs of the anonymous calls, Miller," Elias said, handing over a folder Clara had helped him prepare. "They're harassing you too. If this continues, I'll deal with it legally, and I'll keep your shop out of the crossfire. You don't have to be afraid of her anymore." Miller looked at the documents, then at Elias, his expression shifting from unease to a grudging, deep respect. "All right, Thorne. You keep doing what you're doing. I've got your back." Elias turned back to the engine, his hands steady, his mind quiet. He was still in the motel room, he was still divorced, and he was still a long way from the finish line. But the darkness had receded. He was holding the line, and for the first time, he realized that he wasn't just surviving, he was prevailing. He was a father, and he was not going to be broken. The breakthrough didn't come from a dramatic confrontation or a high-stakes stakeout. It came from a mundane piece of mail that had been mistakenly delivered to the motel's front office instead of Elias's old address. It was a letter from a real estate agent, addressed to Sarah, confirming the details of an urgent property appraisal for a house in Oregon, a state 2,000 miles away. Elias sat in his room, the letter trembling in his hands. The family trip Sarah had used to cancel his visit suddenly made horrifying sense. It wasn't a trip, it was a reconnaissance mission to relocate. She was planning to uproot Lily, to take her across the country, effectively erasing him from the child's life by distance alone. The cold precision of the plan hit him with the force of a physical impact. She wasn't just trying to limit his access, she was preparing to sever it permanently. He immediately called Clara. Her voice, usually calm and detached, sharpened the moment he explained what he was holding. Oregon, Elias, that's a nightmare scenario. If she establishes residency there, our jurisdiction becomes a legal labyrinth. We have to file an emergency injunction to block any relocation. But we need to act fast. If she leaves before we get a court order, you'll be fighting an uphill battle in a foreign court for the next 10 years. Elias felt the adrenaline spike, but this time he didn't let it cloud his judgment. He drove to Mac's apartment, his mind racing through the tactical implications. He wasn't just looking at a property appraisal anymore, he was looking at an act of war. She's making a run for it, Elias said, tossing the letter onto Mac's kitchen table. Mac studied the document, his face tightening. Oregon. That's a clean break. She's going to try to sell the house, pull the kid from school, and vanish before the next court date. I can't let her take Lily. Elias said, his voice flat and dangerous. I don't care what the legal costs are. I don't care if I have to sleep on the courthouse steps. If she leaves with my daughter, I lose everything. Then we don't just block it, Mac said, his eyes narrowing. We anticipate it. We need to prove that her intent to move is not a career opportunity, or a lifestyle change, but a deliberate attempt to alienate a custodial parent. If we can show the court she's been planning this in secret, it proves she has no intention of fostering a relationship between you and Lily. The judge will eat that up. For the next 48 hours, Elias and Mac went into overdrive. They didn't sleep. They tracked down public listings, confirmed the appraisal, and even cross-referenced Sarah's recent social media activity with the location of the Oregon property. Every piece of evidence they gathered built a damning portrait of a woman who had been meticulously planning a kidnapping. By legal loophole. It was more than just evidence now, it was an exposure of her deceit. Elias felt a profound sense of clarity. For months, he had been fighting Sarah on her terms, on the terms of his supposed instability, and her supposed victimhood. And now, the fight was simpler, she was a liar, and he was the man who had the proof. As he watched the sun rise over the motel on the second day, he felt a strange, cold calm. He looked at the binder, now thicker than ever, filled with the evidence of her betrayal. He wasn't just a father fighting for his child anymore. He was a sentry guarding the only thing that gave his life meaning. He dialed Clara's number. I have the proof, he said, his voice steady. File the injunction. I want her in front of a judge, and I want her to explain why she's trying to kidnap my daughter. The silence on the other end was momentary, then Clara spoke, her tone uncharacteristically sharp. Get here, Elias, we're going to war. Elias hung up the phone. The hidden truth was out, and for the first time, Sarah didn't have the advantage of the shadows. The silent battle was about to turn into a full-scale legal siege, and he was ready for it. Every brick he had laid, every moment of discipline, every hard-won victory, it had all been preparation for this moment. He was finally going to hold her accountable. And he wouldn't stop until Lily was safe. The courtroom was freezing, the air thin and sharp. Elias stood at the back of the room while Clara argued the emergency injunction before Judge Holloway. Sarah was seated at the opposing table, looking uncharacteristically small. Her usual armor of polished perfection had cracked. She looked frantic, her movements jittery, her eyes constantly darting toward the door, as if expecting an escape route to manifest. Your Honor, Clara's voice cut through the silence like a scalpel. We have evidence that the mother has been making clandestine arrangements to relocate the minor child to Oregon, 2,000 miles away, while simultaneously obstructing court-ordered visitation. This is not a sudden career change. This is a deliberate, premeditated strategy to alienate the father, Mr. Thorne, and deprive him of his parental rights. We move for an immediate injunction to freeze any property sales, withhold the child's passport, and mandate a stay of residence until a full custody hearing can be held. The opposing counsel, Miller, was on his feet instantly. This is preposterous. My client has every right to explore employment opportunities. This is a simple case of a father who is trying to exert control because he cannot accept that his marriage is over. Judge Holloway looked down from the bench, her expression unreadable. She motioned for Clara to approach. Clara handed over the binder, the culmination of weeks of surveillance, the real estate appraisal, the social media logs, the record of every single obstruction. The judge spent a long, agonizing minute flipping through the pages, her brow furrowing deeper with every document she parsed. Elias watched Sarah. She was beginning to hyperventilate. The weight of her own deceit was physically crushing her in that high-backed chair. She had banked on him being a broken, passive victim. But the man standing in this courtroom was a strategist, a man who had been trained to anticipate his enemy's next move long before they made it. The judge finally closed the binder with a sharp, echoing thud that seemed to silence the entire room. She looked directly at Sarah. Ms. Thorne, this court issued a clear order regarding visitation. Your counsel suggests this move is for employment, but these documents suggest you have been actively concealing your intent and undermining a direct court order. You are on the verge of being held in contempt. Sarah tried to speak, but her voice failed her. Miller stepped in, his voice wavering. Your Honor, we can explain. I don't want an explanation, the judge snapped. I want compliance. The motion for an emergency injunction is granted. The child is to remain in this jurisdiction. Any attempt to relocate without prior written authorization from this court will result in an immediate temporary transfer of custody to Mr. Thorne. Do I make myself clear? Sarah let out a choked sound, a mix of fury and pure unadulterated terror. Elias didn't smile. He didn't feel the rush of victory. He felt a profound sense of duty. This wasn't a game, it was a narrow escape. As they walked out of the courtroom, Clara looked at Elias, her eyes wide with a mixture of professional respect and genuine shock. You were right. The paper trail you built, it was the smoking gun. She had no answer for it. She isn't finished, Elias said, his voice calm, his eyes scanning the corridor. She's cornered now. And a cornered animal is more dangerous than one on the hunt. He was right. As he walked toward the exit, Sarah intercepted him, her face twisted into a mask of pure hate. You think you won, she hissed, stopping inches from his face. You think you can force me to stay here? You're a shell of a man, Elias. You're a ghost. You'll never be a father to her, no matter what that judge says. I'll make sure of it. Elias looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the woman he loved, but a broken, desperate person who was drowning in her own bitterness. He felt no anger, only a detached, icy pity. I'm not a ghost, Sarah, he said, his voice steady and low. I'm the man who showed up. While you were planning how to run, I was planning how to be a father. You lost the right to define who I am a long time ago. He walked away, leaving her standing alone in the sterile hallway of the courthouse. The emergency hearing was over, and the injunction was signed. He had held the line, and for the first time, he realized that he had not just stopped her. He had effectively taken command of the narrative. The battle for Lily was shifting, and the outcome was no longer a matter of if, but when. He was ready for the final act. The drive back from the courthouse was silent, the kind of silence that held the weight of a gathering storm. Elias sat in the passenger seat of Clara's car, watching the familiar, mundane landscape of the suburbs roll past. Every house, every street sign, every tree looked the same as it had when he returned from Iraq, yet his perspective had irrevocably shifted. He was no longer the ghost wandering the periphery, he was an active combatant, and he knew now that the terrain of his life had been permanently altered. You realize what you've done, don't you? Clara asked, her eyes fixed on the road, her hands tight on the steering wheel. You didn't just win emotion. You stripped her of her greatest advantage, the ability to act without consequence. She's going to be frantic now. She's going to lash out, and she won't be using finesse. She'll use blunt force. Let her. Elias replied, his voice barely more than a murmur, though it carried a steel-like resolution. I've been expecting her to lash out since the moment I walked through that front door. At least now, I know what I'm looking for. He returned to the motel, but he didn't go inside. He stood in the parking lot, the evening air cooling his skin, the sounds of the distant interstate a constant, low-frequency hum. He pulled out the photo of Lily from his pocket. He didn't just see a daughter. He saw the future he was building, a future that was being forged in the furnace of this legal war. He knew that the emergency injunction was only a temporary barrier. Sarah would have time to prepare, to hire new experts, to dig deeper into the mud of his service record, and to create even more elaborate narratives of his instability. The final custody trial would be the definitive engagement, the one that decided everything. There would be no more temporary measures, no more first steps. It would be absolute. He went inside and sat on the edge of the bed. He pulled out the binder, now even heavier with the judge's order, and started to organize his notes for the next phase. He was tired, a deep, cellular fatigue that no amount of sleep could touch, but his mind was sharp, focused, and unyielding. Mac arrived an hour later, bringing a takeout container of lukewarm food and a case of water. He sat down without a word, sensing that Elias was deep in the planning stage. "She's going to try to paint you as a liability one last time," Max said, breaking the silence. "When the final hearing comes, she's going to bring in psychologists, character witnesses, anyone who will stand in front of that judge and lie if they have to. We need to be ready to dismantle every single one of them. We need to turn their own witnesses against them. I have a plan for that," Elias said, pointing to a section of his notes that he had been refining for weeks. "I'm going to request an independent court-appointed custody evaluator, someone she can't buy, someone she can't charm. If I have to be scrutinized, then she does, too. Let the truth show up in the evaluation. Let the neutral party see who is actually parenting and who is merely performing." Mac looked at the plan, a rare, genuine grin spreading across his face. "That's it, Thorne, that's the move. You take the fight into her own territory and make her play by the same rules she tried to drown you with." As the night wore on, Elias didn't feel the paralyzing fear of the past. He felt the cold, hard calm that descended upon a man just before he crossed the line of departure. The storm was coming. He could feel it in the tension of the air, in the unpredictability of Sarah's desperation. But he was no longer afraid of the storm. He had built his shelter, he had armed his position, and he was finally, truly ready to win. He closed the binder, the snap of the metal rings sounding final. He was ready. Whatever Sarah threw at him next, whatever the court demanded, he would stand. He was the man who showed up, and he was the man who would be there when the dust finally settled. The silent battle was nearing its climax, and he was already standing on the other side.